Our wonderful Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, as Harry covered in this popular segment on lotuseaters.com with nearly 350,000 views on YouTube, conducted pro bono work on behalf of child murderers to abolish the death penalty in Jamaica. And obviously, as I covered today on the podcast, on the 27th of November, he worked pro bono, often on behalf of suspected and even downright confirmed terrorists, to have their freedom of movement restrictions removed under the European Court of Human Rights, European Convention on Human Rights. He also worked on behalf of Hizb ut-Tahrir for free, while Director of Public Prosecutions, to prevent them from being a prescribed group. They were now prescribed at the start of this year. So Keir Starmer constantly defends child murderers and terrorists because he's really interested in their human rights. And this was a very strong presentation by Harry and Josh. And Harry used this following article to look into Keir Starmer's legal history, but I think I'm going to use some other items from this article that were omitted, I think, for the sake of time, and also because the focus was different, to cover the fact that Keir Starmer has been a lifelong communist, and he hasn't hidden it. And this perception that he was to the right of Blair, or a moderate, or boring, or even attractive, sort of dishy by Moran. Yeah, that's all a fabrication. He is a dyed-in-the-wool socialist radical who has marched his way through the institutions, reached the highest office in the land, and is now governing like Joseph Stalin. So, Keir Starmer, known as a radical barrister throughout his career, was a rebel against the conservative mood of the Times, and this is a quote from the Times. At Oxford, he had been a member of the editorial collective for a Marxist journal, Socialist Alternatives, affiliated with an obscure Greek Trotskyist, Michalis Raptis, who we will be talking about later, because Peter Hitchens happens to know quite a lot about him. He has a focus on green issues, women's rights, and gay equality, so woke. Climate issues, LGBT, women's issues, and we can add race communism to that as a recent innovation because it didn't exist really until the American import of critical race theory from the 1990s made its way over here, combined with post-colonial theory, and became race communism. Woke is just gay race communism, or as I like to call it, liberal accelerationism. Quote, he's a radical barrister, certainly, which in the 80s was still a very conservative profession. Gavin Miller KC, a colleague throughout Keir Starmer's legal career, said, We were doing what was called civil liberties work at the bar during the Thatcher years when it was very difficult. It wasn't terribly well paid. It was all legal aid, or at best, trade unions would fund you, or an NGO. And so Margaret Thatcher's expansion of the NGO bureaucracy, and then Tony Blair's, has facilitated Keir Starmer's rise to the ranks as a fundamental midwit, but a die-hard revolutionary who is getting paid to undermine the rule of law in this country and let criminals and terrorists go free. The young Starmer joined and later became secretary of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, named after Labour's first Lord Chancellor, Viscount Haldane, who served in the 1920s. Starmer proclaimed his idealistic views in the Society's magazine, Socialist Lawyer. He and a co-author argued for trade unions to aspire to, quote, socialist self-management, and declared that collective bargaining was insufficient because it failed to involve ownership of the means of production. So, full-on economic Marxist. Quote, we could do worse than to begin by dismantling those common law rules governing the property entitlements of private parties, which for almost 1,000 years judges have been happy to regard as pre-political norms, he wrote in 1995. Right, 1995, he was arguing for a constitutional revolution against the common law, to instantiate Marxist collective ownership of the means of production. And he has been chief prosecutor and is now prime minister. Brilliant. He called in 1987, while still writing for Socialist Alternatives, for a 35-hour work week as a step towards, quote, a different society in which people will have time and scope to develop away from the oppression of the workplace. Unless, of course, you're a native-born Briton, in which case you have to pay the highest tax burden since the Second World War to fund hotels for Tom, Dick and Abdul, at an increasing cost under his Home Secretary to £32.7 billion. Thanks very much. Starmer joined a trip to Moscow and St. Petersburg shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, organised by Bowring for students he taught at the University of East London. A few years later, Starmer organised a 45-strong delegation to the International Association of Democratic Lawyers Congress in Cape Town, South Africa, where they met President Mandela. Now, remember, Nelson Mandela, whose statue should not be in Parliament Square, was a member of the South African Communist Party, and his African National Congress, ANC, was responsible for killing civilians in terrorist attacks, and his wife, Winnie, also a communist, promoted necklacing as a method of execution for their political enemies. That involves putting a tie around their neck, setting it alight, and burning them to death as a measure of torture. So yeah, Nelson Mandela, not a civil rights hero, reprehensible individual, known race communist, and Keir Starmer, flew out to South Africa to meet him after visiting the Soviet Union. Starmer worked pro bono for the Death Penalty Project, a charity run out of the law firm Simons, Muirhead, Burton that receives funding from the Foreign Office. Great. European Union and charitable foundations, and fights the death penalty around the world. He helped abolish the death penalty in Belize and Jamaica, as Harry had covered before. Starmer helped Ugandan lawyers secure a ruling from the Constitutional Court in 2005, declaring the mandatory death penalty unconstitutional, saving the lives of more than 400 prisoners, sparing potentially 400 convicted criminals who did the most heinous possible crimes from getting the justice they actually deserve. In 2007, the Malawi High Court scrapped the mandatory death penalty, of course, because Keir Starmer had set the standard. Quote, "So then I got into sort of strategic litigation," Starmer told the alumni magazine for the University of Leeds, from which he graduated in 1985. Quote, "Can we pick cases that will change the law for a whole class of people?" Right, so he's against the common law, he's against the Christian underpinnings of the common law as an atheist, which says that every innocent human being has inviolable dignity, and per the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you cannot persecute innocent people on behalf of pursuing justice for the guilty, and so we have the presumption of innocence, and there must be an incredibly high standard to prove guilt and then punish them accordingly with the death penalty, as God himself did and is advised in many places in the Bible, including from Jesus Christ himself. And so Keir Starmer wants to scrap all of that. He wants to scrap the individual rule of law and instead set law according to class membership, because he's a Marxist. We're just telling you all this for years. Weird how this wasn't widely publicised. It's almost like the press wanted to keep it from you. Oh, and in regards to my discussion of the human rights regime with barrister Anna Lutfi last week, it turns out Keir Starmer was involved very heavily in making this the precedent across Britain. So, setting case law for why we can't deport foreign criminals and terrorists, Labour had pledged to bring in a British Bill of Rights after 1997, when Tony Blair won the election, and it was in its manifesto. And the Human Rights Act was passed in 1998, entrenching the European Court of Human Rights into British law and waging a constitutional revolution against common law, as Keir Starmer would have wanted. In an article for The Independent in 1999, Starmer wrote of hopes that the Act would, quote, "create a human rights culture in the UK." The start date had been delayed until 2000, so judges and tribunal members could be trained in human rights law. Training Starmer helped to deliver. Quote, "The idea of Doughty Street training magistrates and the police is bizarre," Starmer would later remark, "but we are writing the manuals." That year, he wrote a guide to the Act, analysing the law in 1500 Strasbourg cases that affected the UK. The textbook, quote, "kind of took the legal world by storm," McKay recalled. Quote, "This was a book with academic and forensic rigour, but inherently pragmatic for this new wave of lawyers that would be working with the Human Rights Act." Right, so he wrote a flat-pack handbook for judicial activism, which we are now using. So anytime the European Convention on Human Rights is used to frustrate the deportations of foreign criminals, or the recent ruling that stipulated that it was too hot for 5 boomers to go on holiday, therefore the UK must hand over trillions in climate reparations to nuclear-armed Pakistan to help control the weather for some reason, that's Keir Starmer's fault. Yeah, that's his fault. Brilliant. Thanks. So, Starmer, as well, is even longer communist history, it turns out, because he ended up in the communist spy files because he joined a Czechoslovakian work camp during the Cold War. So he travelled to Czechoslovakia in 1986, he was 23, to restore a memorial to the victims of a Nazi atrocity. Now you might think, oh, how very benevolent of him. He's commemorating the fallen victims to the evil, murderous, genocidal Nazi regime. And I think, we wouldn't object to such memorials being put up. But what's interesting is why he kept frequenting the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc during the Cold War while also writing for socialist magazines. Big question marks over that. Lots of questions raised by people that met him there at the time as well in this article. So Starmer's full name, date and place of birth, passport number, and family home address were listed, among others, in an international work camp participants dossier discovered by the Mail in, quote, "Foreign Intelligence Main Director Operative Files section of the Czechoslovakian Secret Police Archives. His visa application, including passport photo and handwritten personal details, are kept in separate section of the Czech Cold War State Security Service Archives. Files marked top secret from a previous international work camp in Prague in 1982 show it was overseen by the ruthless Czech STB spy agency as part of a wide-ranging and far-reaching active measure." For those who don't know, active measures were Soviet secret police operations that were acts of subterfuge, the kinds that Yuri Bezmenov spoke about, where they were trying to wage psychological warfare operations and cultural indoctrination against hostile Western nations. So when we refer to cultural Marxism, yeah, this is a pretty good example of it. It was directed by the KGB. And one prominent active measure was the creation of liberation theology as an insurrectionary movement in Latin America, in the Catholic churches, to create a sort of hotbed of Marxist activism on America's doorstep. Just so happened to have produced current Pope Francis, which is why he says that Marxism and Christianity are compatible. Spoiler alert, they're not. Go see my video on why Jesus Christ is not a socialist, God bless his name, on the website for a detailed breakdown as to that. But wholly incompatible, especially according to the Ten Commandments of thou shalt not steal, might be a bit of a barrier to overcome for someone who wants to abolish private property by the bayonet and cannon. Anyway, Professor Anthony Glees says the Czechoslovakian secret police was using these camps to gather information on bright and idealistic young people in the hope that one day they might be of use to them one way or another. Oh, wouldn't it be a really useful thing for the Soviet Union if an up-and-coming lawyer who set international human rights case law and went on to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom later down the line was a dyed-in-the-wool socialist revolutionary who kept visiting your country? Fascinating. The secret police apparently planted a spy posing as the camp supervisor among the foreign students in 1982 to produce a classified dossier profiling the visitors, which earmarked some for, quote, further exploration who could be potentially, quote, of use in future. So how do we not know that there wasn't a Czechoslovakian secret police spy in Keir Starmer's cohort 4 years later, cajoling him further towards being a communist revolutionary? We don't. Open question. He's Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Excellent. Pete Hitchens, though, knows a lot more about Keir Starmer's history, because Peter Hitchens was a Trotskyist at one point in time. I know he's a bit curmudgeonly, and we've had our set twos on Twitter, and I think his last-minute campaigning for the Conservative government, whether he likes that characterisation or not, has undercut some of his credibility among men of my generation. But given he was a Labour Party activist and a committed Trotskyist in the 1960s, he knew the sort of climate that Keir Starmer would later go to university in. And so he elaborates. Keir Starmer was questioned in 2020 by the New Statesman about his radicalism in the 80s when he was known as a Red Green, the previous mentioned membership of that university society. And Starmer said that he was not at all embarrassed by this. The Red Green label, as Hitchens explains, combines social radicalism and identity politics, gay race communism, with green zealotry, net zero. Hence why Starmer hesitated when asked, can women have a penis? Because he genuinely believes that, and the only reason he backed off of that is because Tony Blair advised him for electoral expedient reasons to do so. Of course, when Starmer was asked by interviewer Patrick Maguire if he was still a red-green, Starmer said yeah. So he absolutely is. Keir Starmer is a climate-obsessed gay race communist, to his core, as recently as 2020. Don't think anything would have made him change his mind since, and I think all of his policies, including appointing net zero zealot Ed Miliband in charge of the entire national grid, and he's now spending potentially trillions on renewables that won't work and will cause blackouts. I think that demonstrates he's still committed to those policies. In a crucial exchange in the same interview, this is Hitchens, Starmer made it impossible for himself to claim that his political past was not relevant to his political present. He said, quote, I don't think there are any big issues on which I've changed my mind. The big issue we were grappling with then was how the Labour Party, or the left generally, bound together the wider movement at strands of equality, feminist politics, green politics, LGBT, which I thought was incredibly exciting and incredibly important. So, Starmer has spent his life advocating for the immiseration of the British worker via expensive, unworkable energy policies, the confiscation of childhoods from gender-confused children, and the abolition of biological sex. And so Hitchens goes into the university society that Keir Starmer was a part of. Red Green, the sort of unholy alliance of net zero and socially liberal policies under the umbrella of Marxism, was coined by aforementioned Greek socialist Michalis Raptis. I'm sure Stelios has particular disdain for that chap. He was involved in the Algerian War of Independence and imprisoned in the 1960s for supposedly smuggling money and weapons to rebels. He was given a state funeral in Athens in 1966 by his friend, a Greek socialist leader called Andreas Papandreou. He was nicknamed Michel Pablo, and he so founded Pabloism, a form of environmentally conscious, socially liberal Trotskyism, the sort that Keir Starmer was infatuated with. And so Hitchens definitively states, so Keir Starmer is in fact a Pabloite. Starmer belonged to the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. This was before the end of the Cold War. In the autumn of 1989, an issue of Socialist Lawyer, the Haldane Society's magazine, Keir was listed as the group's secretary. A list of resolutions for the Society's forthcoming annual general meeting includes a call welcoming Soviet peace proposals and urging the Labour Party to adopt a non-nuclear, non-aligned, non-NATO defence. So basically, dismantle NATO at the height of the Cold War, unilaterally nuclear disarm the UK, US and its allies, ... Soviet Union won't nuke us, or win, we hope. Or they hope that it would win. And this is the giveaway, because the Haldane Society was notorious at the time as being, let's put this politely, sympathetic to the British Communist Party. They'll be coming up later. And Hitchens doubts whether any left-wing lawyer alive in 1989 could have been unaware of this. Generally, Labour-supporting lawyers preferred to join the mainstream Society of Labour Lawyers, formed in 1949 after an explosive split. At the time, anti-communist socialists had tried to break the Haldane Society's communist links, narrowly losing their battle in the secret ballot. At that point, almost all the senior Labour lawyers in the Haldane Society, including the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Stafford Cripps, and the former Lord Chancellor, Gerald Gardner, angrily walked out. Yet in the years where communism still mattered, Starmer chose not just to join the Haldane Society, but to become its secretary. He kept his membership of this until 2008, when he became the Director of Prosecutions for the Crown Prosecution Service. So when he rose to a position of public scrutiny, he then quietly shelved a membership that he'd been keeping for nearly 20 years. Curious. Also, he's not the only one to have ties with the British Communist Party. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor. If you can see in this image here, obviously audio listeners won't, but the video will. She's in number 11 Downing Street, the conjoining house to number 10, where the Chancellor has their residence, and she's put up a new photo. Now, beforehand, this photo was Nigel Lawson, one of the Chancellors for Margaret Thatcher. She's replaced it with Ellen Wilkinson. She was a Labour MP. She's also one of the co-founders of the British Communist Party in 1920 and nicknamed Red Ellen. One biographer of Wilkinson, described her as, quote, a self-professed Marxist throughout her political career, and she also travelled to the Soviet Union for a congress of the Communist Internationale. Asked whether Rachel Reeves was a socialist in May, she says, I've always called myself a social democrat. Keir Starmer, on the other hand, has just called himself an out-and-out socialist. So we're just governed by demented communists in the UK. Good to know. Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.